My name is Willow. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as steady, dependable, quiet. The kind of woman you don't worry about because she seems to have everything under control. I live a structured life, I keep my promises, and I don't raise my voice to be heard. People often mistake that for softness. If you asked my friends, or my husband at the time, they would have said I was practical, loyal, maybe a little too patient. The woman who remembered birthdays, handled paperwork, and smoothed over awkward moments. I was the background stability that made other people's lives feel easier. Not fragile, just predictable, safe. That perception mattered more than I realized. This is not a story about rage or revenge or dramatic confrontations in parking lots. It's not a story where someone storms out, slams doors, or delivers a perfectly rehearsed speech at just the right moment. I don't believe in those stories anymore. Real life doesn't resolve itself that neatly. This is a story about noticing, about how small dismissals accumulate, about how silence can be misread for consent, and about how truth doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, tucked inside a stack of legal documents you weren't even looking at yet. I didn't go searching for proof of my husband's affair. I didn't hire a private investigator or check his phone in the middle of the night. The truth showed up before the lawyer did. It waited patiently, printed in black ink, filed where no one expected me to read carefully. What followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. In this story, I won't pretend I was perfect. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I ignored instincts that whispered instead of screamed. I benefited from the illusion of harmony because it made daily life easier. That's something I own fully. But I also won't exaggerate pain for entertainment. What you're about to hear is a slow emotional journey from invisibility to self-recognition, from being underestimated to being unmovable. It's about how preparation can look like passivity to the wrong people, and how dignity, when protected carefully, becomes its own form of power. There are no villains here, at least not in the cartoon sense. Just choices, patterns, and consequences that arrive without shouting. I'm sharing this not to shame anyone, including the man I once loved, but to document what happens when someone finally stops explaining themselves and starts listening. To facts, to behavior, to silence. If you've ever felt like the calm one in the room, the person everyone assumes will handle it, I wonder, have you ever noticed how often being underestimated becomes the most revealing advantage of all? To the people around me, I was easy to define. I was the wife who held everything together, the one who remembered which bills were due, which forms needed signatures, and which relatives needed checking in on. At gatherings, I was introduced with phrases like, "She's amazing at organizing things," or "Willow is the responsible one." It was never meant as an insult. It just quietly placed me in a category, useful, dependable, not particularly mysterious. My husband leaned into that version of me without realizing it. Or maybe he realized it very well. In our marriage, I was the infrastructure. The smooth running system allowed him to feel free, creative, and unburdened. If something went wrong, I absorbed it. If something needed planning, I handled it. I didn't do this out of martyrdom. I did it because I was good at it, and because early on, it felt like love. People often confuse competence with emotional immunity. They assume that because I didn't complain, I didn't mind. Because I didn't ask for reassurance, I didn't need it. Because I didn't demand attention, I didn't notice when it drifted elsewhere. I was calm, so they assumed I was unaffected. What they didn't see was how carefully I watched. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered the room, how plans were already decided, details already agreed upon. I noticed how my opinions were acknowledged politely, then overridden without discussion. I noticed how praise came in the form of gratitude for labor, not appreciation for presence. None of it was dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. Invisibility doesn't arrive as cruelty. It arrives as convenience. I became the person others relied on without ever checking if I wanted the role. The person whose silence was interpreted as agreement. The person whose emotional steadiness became a reason to give less, not more. At work, it was similar. I was trusted with responsibility, but excluded from influence. I fixed problems quietly and efficiently, which meant fewer people noticed they existed at all. Success was attributed to the system, not the person maintaining it. At home, I became predictable. And predictability, I learned, invites carelessness. My husband didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray me. He simply stopped seeing me as someone who might leave, or notice, or draw a line. That assumption shaped everything. I didn't fight for attention because I didn't believe love should require competition. I didn't interrogate absences because I trusted consistency. I didn't dramatize hurt because I thought maturity meant absorbing discomfort gracefully. From the outside, this looked like patience, strength even. From the inside, it felt like slowly being edited out of my own life. But here's the part that's important. I wasn't unaware, I was unreactive. There's a difference. I stored moments instead of confronting them. A canceled dinner here, a distracted response there, a new habit that didn't quite fit the old story. I told myself I was being generous, understanding, and evolved. In truth, I was observing, not with suspicion, with curiosity. Because when you are underestimated, you're given an unusual gift. People stop performing for you. They assume you won't challenge the narrative, so they stop refining it. They reveal patterns instead of excuses. I didn't feel small during this time. I felt quiet, and quiet is often mistaken for absence. To my husband, I was stable, non-threatening, the last person he thought would question the structure of our marriage. To others, I was fine, the woman who didn't need checking in on. No one thought I was watching closely, and that was the version of me they were most comfortable with. The one who would keep things running smoothly, who wouldn't interrupt momentum, who wouldn't force anyone to sit with discomfort. They didn't realize that being unseen doesn't make someone powerless. Sometimes it makes them precise. I didn't yet know where this awareness would lead. I hadn't named betrayal, or loss, or endings. I was simply beginning to understand the role I had been assigned, and how thoroughly everyone believed I would keep playing it, including him. The first moment didn't arrive with shock. That's what makes it difficult to explain. It was ordinary, almost forgettable. The kind of moment that slips past most people because nothing technically goes wrong. No raised voices, no accusation, no visible damage. We were at a small dinner, nothing formal, a few friends, casual conversation, the kind of night that's supposed to feel easy. Someone asked a question about a decision my husband and I had made together. Before I could answer, he did. Not incorrectly, just completely. He spoke as if the decision had been his alone, as if I hadn't been involved, as if my role was administrative at best, execution, not thought. Everyone nodded. The conversation moved on. I smiled because that's what I always did. Because interrupting would have felt unnecessary. Because correcting him would have felt petty. Because I told myself it didn't matter. But something in me paused, not emotionally, mentally. I replayed the moment later, not with anger, but with curiosity. Why had he answered so quickly? Why hadn't he even glanced at me? Why did it feel like the room had accepted a version of our life that quietly erased my presence? I didn't confront him. That part is important. I mentioned it lightly a few days later, framed as a clarification rather than a complaint. He laughed it off, said I was overthinking it, said it wasn't a big deal, said, "You know what I meant?" And I let it go. But I didn't forget it. That was the first small cut. Not because it hurt deeply, but because it revealed something. A shift so subtle it could only be detected by someone paying attention. After that, similar moments appeared. Not often, not enough to justify concern, just enough to establish a pattern if you were quietly collecting data. A plan changed without discussion. A comment made about me instead of to me. A decision announced rather than shared. Each moment was small enough to be dismissed individually, and everyone else did dismiss them. Friends chalked it up to stress, work demands, marriages settling into a routine. They saw a stable couple, a calm woman, no visible conflict, nothing to intervene in. That's the danger of being composed. People assume you don't need backup. I started noticing how often I was spoken to, rather than with. How my husband began summarizing my thoughts instead of inviting them. How my silence, once a mutual understanding, had become a convenience. Still, I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize, I didn't even label it disrespect. I told myself I was being flexible. Those relationships evolve. That this was what a long-term partnership looked like when things were busy. But the body notices things before the mind is ready to name them. I felt a slight tightening in my chest during certain conversations. A subtle alertness, not fear, attention. The kind that comes when something no longer aligns perfectly, even if you can't articulate why. The most unsettling part wasn't what he did. It was how comfortable he seemed doing it, as if he assumed I would adapt. As if my role was elastic, capable of shrinking without resistance. As if my silence had been interpreted not as trust, but as permission. That realization stayed with me, not angrily, quietly. I began to understand that the first small cut in a relationship is rarely about the act itself. It's about the test. a moment where someone unconsciously checks how much space they can take before being challenged. And when no challenge comes, conclusions are drawn. I didn't correct the record publicly. I didn't assert myself loudly. I simply adjusted where I placed my attention. I started listening less to words and more to behavior, less to explanations and more to assumptions. Everyone else forgot that moment. I didn't, because once you notice the first small cut, you don't bleed from it. You measure it, and you begin to wonder how many more would be dismissed as nothing, until they formed something undeniable. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's how normalization works. There was no sudden shift in tone, no obvious rupture that would have justified alarm. Instead, there was repetition. The same kinds of moments spaced just far enough apart that each one felt isolated. Easy to excuse, easier to forget, if you wanted to. I noticed that my husband began making plans without checking in, then informing me afterward as if he were doing me a favor by keeping me updated. Dinners rearranged, weekends restructured, commitments assumed. When I questioned it gently, he'd say something like, "I didn't think you'd mind," or "You're usually flexible." And he was right. I had built a reputation for being accommodating, for not needing much, for adapting quietly. Over time, that reputation hardened into expectation. What unsettled me wasn't that he took more space. It was how natural it felt to him, how little friction there was, how rarely he paused to consider whether my agreement was real or simply habitual. I told myself I was choosing peace, that silence was maturity, that pushing back would introduce unnecessary tension. I had seen enough couples turn every small disagreement into a battlefield. I didn't want that life, so I reframed things internally. He's under pressure. This is just a phase. Every marriage has asymmetries. These explanations weren't lies. They were just incomplete. What I didn't yet admit was that the cost of this peace was invisibility, that each time I swallowed a reaction, I trained him to expect it. That respect doesn't usually vanish all at once. It erodes in environments where it's never reinforced. The dismissals became more casual, not cruel, casual. He would check his phone while I was speaking, finish my sentences inaccurately, make jokes that positioned me as overly cautious or low maintenance, earning laughs from others. None of it was sharp enough to confront without sounding overly sensitive. And I was very aware of how I would look if I did. That awareness kept me quiet. There's a specific loneliness that comes from being dismissed politely, from being disagreed with gently, from being overridden with a smile. You start to doubt your own reactions, not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient. I still functioned well, better than well. I handled work, maintained friendships, took care of logistics. On the surface, nothing was broken, but something subtle had shifted inside me. I began to feel like I was living alongside my life rather than inside it, like I was supporting a structure that no longer fully included me. The most dangerous thing I told myself was this: it's not worth making a big deal out of, because that sentence can excuse almost anything. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was afraid of being seen as the problem, afraid that asserting myself would reframe me from easy to difficult, afraid that speaking up would require emotional labor I wasn't ready to perform. So I stayed quiet, not passively but strategically, though I didn't have language for that yet. I watched how often he assumed I'd agree, how rarely he checked for consent versus compliance, how comfortable he had become narrating our shared life as if it were primarily his. And I began to understand something unsettling. People rarely push boundaries out of malice. They push them out of certainty. Certainty that nothing will happen if they do. My silence was feeding that certainty, but it was also feeding something else, my awareness. I started writing things down, not obsessively, just dates, phrases, patterns. Not to build a case, but to ground myself, to ensure I wasn't imagining a trajectory that wasn't there. The trajectory was there. I still loved him. That's important to say. This wasn't hatred or resentment. It was dissonance. The gap between how I was treated and how I experienced myself. I didn't feel weak during this period. I felt restrained, like someone holding their breath, waiting for clarity before deciding whether to speak. Normalization doesn't numb you completely. It just dulls the alarm enough that you start negotiating with it. And I was negotiating daily, telling myself this was temporary, that I could adapt a little longer, that nothing irreversible had happened. I didn't yet know how wrong that last assumption was, but I was beginning to understand that staying quiet doesn't preserve respect. It reallocates it, and unless that pattern is interrupted, it doesn't correct itself. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that what I was experiencing wasn't a phase in our marriage. It was a role. Once I saw it that way, everything snapped into focus. I had been cast as the stabilizer, the one who absorbed friction so others didn't have to, the one who made life smoother, quieter, and more efficient. My value is measured in how little disruption I caused, and I had performed that role flawlessly. At home, I handled the unglamorous parts of our life without complaint. Finances, scheduling, and coordination with extended family. I knew where everything was, what needed attention, and what could wait. This competence became invisible because it was constant. Reliability, when uninterrupted, fades into the background. My husband didn't thank me less over time. He just stopped noticing the effort entirely. Appreciation was replaced by assumption. At social events, I was the agreeable presence, the one who didn't contradict publicly, the one who lets comments slide to keep things comfortable. People describe me as low drama, which I once took as a compliment. I didn't realize how often that label is used to justify neglect. Being easy to be around often means being easy to overlook. I began to notice how often my needs were framed as optional, how my preferences were treated as suggestions, how decisions were discussed with me only after they had already solidified. No one said, "Your voice doesn't matter." They didn't have to. The structure of interactions said it for them. The most unsettling part was how smoothly everyone adapted to this version of me, including myself. I had internalized the role so deeply that stepping outside it felt unnatural. Speaking up felt like breaking character. I told myself I didn't need much, that independence meant self-sufficiency, that wanting to be consulted was an unnecessary ego. But the truth was simpler. I had become useful instead of essential. Useful people are appreciated until they're inconvenient. Essential people are consulted before decisions are made. That distinction haunted me. My husband didn't see himself as dismissive. In his mind, he was efficient, decisive. He thought he was relieving me of a burden, not removing me from consideration. He had grown used to me adapting quietly, so he planned accordingly. And I allowed it, by staying silent, by smoothing over, by continuing to perform competence without boundaries. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from being reliable without being regarded, from being needed but not centered, from realizing that your presence is valued for function, not influence. I didn't feel angry, I felt misplaced, like a foundational piece that had been absorbed into the structure so completely that no one remembered it could move. The role I was assigned didn't come with malice. It came with convenience, with comfort, with the assumption that I would continue exactly as I had been. Once I saw the role, I started to understand how difficult it would be to step out of it, not because I lacked strength, but because everyone else depended on me staying where I was. Changing would disrupt the system, and systems resist disruption. I didn't confront anyone yet. I didn't announce a shift. I simply stopped identifying with the role internally. I observed how often it was reinforced, how frequently my silence was rewarded with ease for others. That awareness didn't make me bitter. It made me deliberate. Because when you recognize the role you've been assigned, you're faced with a choice. Continue performing it unconsciously or step back and decide when and if you'll play it at all. I hadn't decided yet, but I knew one thing with certainty: remaining invisible was no longer accidental, and that meant it could no longer be ignored. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no discovery, no moment that anyone else would recognize as important. It happened on a weekday morning, quietly, without witnesses. I was standing in our kitchen, early enough that the light hadn't fully settled into the room yet. The house was still. My husband had already left for work, earlier than usual, without saying much beyond a distracted goodbye. His coffee mug sat in the sink, unwashed. His jacket was gone. Nothing about the scene was new. What changed was my reaction to it. I remember looking at that mug and realizing I no longer felt compelled to tidy up the evidence of his absence. Not out of spite, out of neutrality. The urge to smooth things over, to restore order immediately, simply wasn't there. That pause startled me. I stood there longer than necessary, not thinking, just noticing. How quiet the house felt. How much of that quiet I usually fill with activity. How automatic my movements had become. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I stopped compensating, what would actually happen? I didn't answer it, I just let it sit. That day at work, I was unusually observant. Not distracted, attentive. I noticed how often I was asked to step in without being invited to weigh in. How frequently my efficiency allowed others to move faster without including me. It was the same pattern, everywhere. But instead of feeling drained by it, I felt clear. Clarity doesn't arrive as emotion. It arrives as alignment, a sense that something unspoken has finally named itself. I realized that I had been confusing peace with self-erasure, that my silence hadn't been neutral, it had been shaping outcomes, that by staying agreeable, I had been participating in my own marginalization. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me still. That evening, my husband talked about his day at length. I listened, as I always did. But I noticed something else, how rarely he asked about mine. How the conversation flowed in one direction unless I redirected it. I didn't redirect it. I wasn't testing him. I wasn't punishing him. I was observing what happened when I didn't fill the space. The silence didn't bother him. That was the answer. Later that night, lying in bed, I felt something close to grief, but not for the marriage. For the version of myself that had believed presence alone was enough to be considered. I understood then that nothing would change unless I changed. Not outwardly, not yet, but internally, in what I tolerated, in what I documented, in what I prepared for. This wasn't a decision to leave. It wasn't even a decision to confront. It was a decision to stop assuming the best in the absence of evidence. I began to separate observation from interpretation, behavior from intention, pattern from an excuse. I didn't tell myself stories anymore. I just noted what was happening. And what was happening was this. My husband was comfortable in a dynamic where my voice was optional. That realization settled quietly into my bones. The next morning, I started doing small things differently, not visibly, intentionally. I stopped volunteering information, stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't explicitly mine, stopped cushioning conversations. No one noticed. That was confirmation. The day something shifted wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with certainty or resolution. It came with a recalibration, a subtle but irreversible internal adjustment. I hadn't decided what I would do yet, but I knew I was done performing a role that required my silence as proof of loyalty. From that day on, silence would no longer be automatic. It would be chosen. Once I understood that silence could be intentional, everything changed. Before, my quiet had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of smoothing edges and avoiding friction. Now it has become selective. I spoke when it mattered to me, not when it maintained comfort for others. The difference was subtle but profound. I stopped correcting misunderstandings unless the correction benefited me. I stopped filling conversational gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped reminding my husband of things he was capable of remembering himself. None of this looked like rebellion. It looked calm. And calm is often misinterpreted. My husband didn't ask if something was wrong. He assumed I was tired, busy, preoccupied. He adjusted by taking up more space, not less, talking longer, deciding faster, moving without checking. That told me everything I needed to know. When silence is mistaken for weakness, people reveal how they behave when they think there will be no consequences. I began to notice how often he narrated plans that didn't include me. Trips were discussed as if my availability was guaranteed. Social commitments made on my behalf. Financial assumptions presented as facts. I didn't interrupt, I didn't argue. I wrote things down, not as evidence against him, but as evidence for myself. Dates, decisions, discrepancies, patterns between words and actions. I wasn't building a case yet, I was building clarity. At work, the same approach yielded similar insight. When I stopped compensating, delays appeared. When I stopped anticipating needs, oversights became visible. My absence from the problem-solving process didn't create chaos, but it revealed dependency. No one accused me of disengaging. They just noticed things took longer, and still no one asked why. That was the most telling part. Silence, when chosen deliberately, functions like a mirror. It reflects the assumptions others have been operating under all along. It shows you who benefits from your voice, and who only benefits from your compliance. I didn't feel triumphant during this period. I felt grounded. There was relief in no longer explaining myself internally, in no longer softening reactions before they even formed, in letting reality stand without my constant interpretation. My husband grew more casual with omissions, more comfortable with half-truths. Not because he became worse, but because the environment had changed. He believed I wasn't paying attention anymore. In truth, I had never been more focused. I noticed inconsistencies in his schedule, vague explanations, stories that didn't quite align with previous details. Nothing concrete. Nothing justified confrontation, but enough to warrant attention. Silence allowed space for patterns to surface. I didn't spy. I didn't invade privacy. I didn't accuse or interrogate. I simply stopped shielding him from the natural consequences of his assumptions. and he mistook that restraint for disinterest. People often think power announces itself. That strength requires visibility, that if someone isn't pushing back, they aren't preparing. That misunderstanding works in favor of those who move quietly. This was the period when others believed they had the upper hand, where my lack of reaction was interpreted as resignation, where my calm demeanor reinforced the idea that I would adapt, as always. I let them believe it, because reacting too early only teaches people how to hide better. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way people expect. I was alert, observant, unavailable to manipulation. Silence became a filter. It separated what was said from what was done. It gave me a clearer view than confrontation ever could. And with that clarity came a shift in posture, not visible to anyone else, but unmistakable to me. I was no longer waiting for reassurance. I was watching for truth. What they never noticed was how much information lives in the background. When you stop performing, stop reacting, stop explaining, you free up an enormous amount of attention. I wasn't emotionally withdrawn. I was reallocated. The energy that once went into maintaining harmony now went into understanding reality. Quietly, methodically, I started noticing timelines. Not in a suspicious way, but in a structural one. When my husband said he'd be late, how often did it coincide with certain days? When he traveled, which details were vague and which were overly specific? Patterns don't require paranoia, only consistency. I didn't confront discrepancies, I let them exist. At the same time, I turned inward, not emotionally, but practically. I reviewed our shared finances with fresh eyes, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I realized how much responsibility I had carried without ever verifying alignment. Statements, accounts, long-term plans, assumptions I had inherited instead of examined. What struck me wasn't deception, it was imbalance. I understood the structure of our life better than he did. I always had. I just hadn't recognized that knowledge as leverage. I updated passwords, organized documents, made copies, not secretly, but thoroughly. Marriage encourages shared access. I simply took inventory of what was already mine to know. No drama, no urgency. Preparation doesn't require fear, it requires honesty. I also began learning, quietly, about marital law, about financial protection, about options people don't usually explore until something has already gone wrong. I haven't spoken to a lawyer yet. I didn't announce concern. I educated myself. At work, I did something similar. I mapped responsibilities, noted dependencies, clarified which systems relied on my involvement more than anyone realized. This wasn't about control, it was about awareness. When you are consistently underestimated, preparation looks invisible. People assume you are passive because you are calm. They assume you are disengaged because you aren't reactive. They don't see the groundwork being laid because it doesn't disrupt their comfort. That's what makes it effective. My husband grew more relaxed during this time. He seemed confident that things were stable, that I was steady, that nothing required adjustment. Stability, I learned, can be mistaken for permanence. I noticed he stopped offering explanations altogether. Details became optional, schedules became flexible. He assumed trust as a given, not something to maintain. And I let him, not because I believed him, but because I trusted patterns more than promises. I also began documenting, not accusations, just facts, dates, conversations, statements that contradicted previous ones. Again, not obsessively, calmly. Documentation isn't about revenge. It's about grounding yourself in reality when others try to rewrite it later. I didn't feel secretive. I felt responsible. There's a quiet power in knowing you're prepared without needing to prove it. In understanding that you're no longer operating on hope but on information. No one noticed the shift in my posture. My tone didn't change. My routine stayed largely the same. I still showed up, still participated, still smiled. But internally, something had settled. I no longer needed reassurance because I was no longer relying on trust alone. I had structure, context, options. The most surprising part was how peaceful this period felt. There was no anxiety spiral, no late-night speculation, just steady accumulation of clarity. People often think preparation means anticipation of disaster. For me, it was the opposite. It was a return to self-trust, to the agency. I wasn't planning an exit. I was making sure that if the truth surfaced, however it arrived, I would meet it standing, not scrambling. And that truth was closer than I realized, already documented, already filed, already waiting quietly in a place I hadn't yet thought to look. The reveal didn't come from intuition or investigation. It came from paperwork. I wasn't searching for anything that day. I was organizing, something I had always done well, something no one ever questioned. Old folders, tax records, insurance documents, the quiet administrative backbone of a shared life. Divorce papers were not supposed to be there, at least not yet. They were incomplete. Draft level, not finalized. Filed but not served. Tucked into a digital folder that I had access to only because I handled our administrative systems. Because I had always been trusted with logistics. Because no one imagined I would look closely. The truth showed up before the lawyer did. At first, I thought I was misreading something. A name, a reference, a timeline that didn't align. Then I slowed down, read carefully. The way you do when you want to be precise, not reactive. There it was, not explicitly stated but unmistakable. Financial disclosures, asset movement, a secondary address I didn't recognize. Dates that overlapped with times he had said he was working late or traveling with colleagues. And a name, not highlighted, not emphasized, just included, because legally it had to be. I didn't feel my heart race. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger rush in the way people describe. What I felt was confirmation, the kind that settles into your body like weight finding its place. Heavy, yes, but stable. I sat there for a long time, not frozen, grounded. There was no sense of betrayal arriving all at once. No dramatic internal collapse. I had already grieved the erosion. This was simply the final alignment between suspicion and fact. Proof doesn't always shock you. Sometimes it releases you. I didn't confront him. Not that day. Not the next. I didn't even close the file immediately. I reviewed it calmly, methodically, the same way I reviewed everything else. I took notes. Not emotional ones, structural ones. What this meant legally, financially, logistically. What it confirmed about timelines, about omissions, about the assumptions he had made regarding my awareness. The most striking realization wasn't that he had an affair. It was that he had prepared for separation without ever imagining I might already be prepared too. He had underestimated not my intelligence, but my willingness to look. I didn't feel foolish. I didn't feel naive. I felt precise. There's a moment when private truth is revealed, where you're tempted to act immediately, to restore balance through confrontation, to make the other person feel what you're feeling. I didn't have that urge, because nothing was unclear anymore. I finally understood why his confidence had grown, why details had blurred, why explanations had thinned. He wasn't just distracted, he was operating under the assumption that I was already irrelevant to his future planning. And that assumption had shaped every interaction. I closed the file, made a copy, secured it. Then I went on with my day. I made dinner, answered emails, asked him about his work in the same neutral tone I always had. He spoke freely, comfortably, completely unaware that the foundation had shifted beneath him. There was no satisfaction in that, only clarity. That night, lying in bed beside him, I understood something essential. The most powerful advantage I had was not evidence. It was timing. I knew the truth. He believed I didn't. That asymmetry mattered. I didn't feel superior. I felt responsible to myself, to my future, to the woman I was becoming in that moment. I didn't yet know what I would do with the truth. I just knew I wouldn't waste it by reacting impulsively, because when truth arrives quietly, it deserves to be handled with care. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Knowing the truth doesn't automatically tell you what to do with it. That's the part no one prepares you for. For several days after the discovery, I lived in a kind of suspended clarity. I wasn't in denial. I wasn't overwhelmed. I simply allowed myself to exist with the information without rushing to translate it into action. I considered every option. I could confront him immediately, demand explanations, watch him scramble to reassemble a version of reality that no longer holds. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. Apologies framed as confusion, admissions softened by justifications, regret carefully rationed. I could suggest counseling, position myself as willing to repair something that had already been dismantled without my consent. I could accept partial truth in exchange for stability. I could leave quietly, pack a bag, make a clean break before anyone has time to negotiate or reinterpret events. All of these paths were available to me, but availability doesn't equal alignment. I asked myself one question over and over, in different forms. Which choice preserves my dignity without requiring me to perform pain for credibility? The answer wasn't immediate, but it was consistent. I didn't want to be convinced. I didn't want to be reassured. I didn't want to manage his emotions while processing my own. I didn't want explanations that arrived only after proof. And I didn't want to make a decision that could be undone by sentiment. There is a difference between leaving in anger and leaving in resolve. Anger burns quickly. Resolve settles. I realized that the most irreversible choice I could make wasn't divorce itself. It was shifting the locus of control entirely back to myself. Making decisions based on structure, not reaction. Letting consequences unfold without interference. That meant one thing: preparation had to become action. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer, not to file immediately, but to understand options clearly: rights, timelines, exposure. I went in calm, informed, and precise. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. I was in a strong position, financially, legally, strategically. That didn't bring relief, it brought responsibility. Once you know what's possible, you're accountable for choosing deliberately. I didn't tell anyone yet, not friends, not family. I needed my decision to be uncontaminated by opinion, by outrage on my behalf, by advice shaped by other people's fears. This was my life. I also decided something else that day, something quieter but equally irreversible. I stopped imagining a future that included him, not out of bitterness, out of honesty. That internal separation was the real point of no return. Once it happened, everything else became procedural. I didn't change how I behaved toward him. Not yet. I maintained calm, routine, neutrality, not as deception, but as containment. I wasn't ready to share the truth, and I didn't owe him access to my processing. The affair had removed that obligation. What surprised me most was the absence of urgency. I wasn't racing against time. I wasn't afraid of being discovered. I knew that when the truth emerged, because it always does, it would do so on terms I had chosen. I had reached the decision point not through emotion, but through alignment. And once that alignment was locked in, there was no going back. Some choices don't announce themselves with drama. They settle quietly and then shape everything that follows. This was one of them. Once the decision was made, everything became very calm. That calm wasn't numbness, it was a focus. I began moving with intention, but without visibility. Nothing in my daily behavior suggested a shift. I still woke up at the same time, still asked about his day, still attended events, still maintained the rhythm of a shared life. But underneath that rhythm, structure was changing. I opened a separate account in my own name, something I had every right to do, something many people do routinely. I redirected my income quietly, not in a dramatic withdrawal, just in a way that ensured autonomy. Independence doesn't announce itself, it stabilizes. I gathered documents methodically: birth certificates, financial statements, property records, insurance policies, copies of everything that defined the framework of our life together. Not hidden, organized. Organization is not secrecy. I adjusted beneficiaries where appropriate, reviewed long-term plans that had once been theoretical and now needed clarity. I followed legal advice precisely, nothing rushed, nothing emotional. At work, I did something similar. I documented processes, delegated selectively, ensured continuity that didn't rely on my constant presence. Not because I planned to disappear, but because leverage works best when it's optional. People didn't notice these changes because they didn't disrupt anything. Disruption is what attracts attention. Preparation rarely does. My husband continued as he had, confident, unbothered. He spoke about the future in vague terms that no longer included detail. He assumed my agreement, my availability, my silence. I let those assumptions stand. There's a misconception that silence during this phase is manipulative. It isn't. It's protective. I wasn't withholding truth to gain advantage. I was allowing truth to arrive when I was structurally ready to receive it. I didn't confront because confrontation would have required me to manage his response, his shock, his fear, his regret. I refused to make his emotional processing my responsibility. The affair had already established that imbalance. I also resisted the urge to tell friends, not because I was ashamed, but because early disclosure invites premature opinions. I needed my next steps to be guided by clarity, not commentary. Every action I took was reversible except one: my internal detachment. That continued quietly. I stopped imagining explanations, stopped rehearsing conversations, stopped wondering how he would react. When you no longer need someone's understanding, their reaction loses power. He didn't sense the shift. That's not an indictment of him, it's a testament to how consistent I had been. People don't question stability until it's gone, and I hadn't removed it yet. Moving in silence doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It feels procedural, like following a checklist, like building a bridge without announcing where it leads. I wasn't cold. I wasn't calculating in the way people imagine. I was calm, deliberate, and respectful of my own future. There were moments, brief ones, where sadness surfaced. Not for him, but for the version of the marriage I had believed in. I let those moments pass without dramatizing them. Grief doesn't need witnesses to be real. What mattered was that by the time anyone noticed something was wrong, I would no longer be reacting. I would be responding from a position of stability. Silence gave me time. Time gave me options. And options, when chosen intentionally, become freedom. The consequences didn't begin with confrontation. They began with absence. Not physical absence, I was still there, but functional absence. The kind that only becomes visible when something no longer works the way it used to. I stopped compensating. At home, small things began to slip. Not catastrophically, subtly, appointments missed, details overlooked, assumptions left unconfirmed. The invisible labor I had always provided quietly withdrew, not as punishment, but as a boundary. My husband noticed the effects before he noticed the cause. He'd ask questions in passing. "Didn't we already take care of that?" I'd answer honestly, "No, I didn't." No explanation, no apology. At work, the same thing happened. Processes slowed. Decisions required clarification. People realized how often they had relied on my foresight without recognizing it. Not with resentment, with confusion. Confusion is the first consequence of underestimation. Friends sensed a shift too. I was present, but less accommodating. Engaged, but no longer managing the emotional temperature of every interaction. I listened more than I filled the silence. People interpret that as distance. They don't realize it's redistribution. My husband became restless, not suspicious, unsettled. The ease he was used to began to erode. Plans required more effort. Conversations didn't flow as effortlessly. I wasn't confrontational. I was unavailable to assumptions. He didn't ask what had changed. He assumed it would revert. That assumption was the real consequence. When someone is used to your consistency, they believe it's permanent. They don't prepare for its withdrawal. And when it disappears, they feel destabilized without understanding why. He grew more attentive in small ways, not deeply, experimentally. A question here, a check-in there. Not because he had realized the truth, but because he felt something slipping out of alignment. I didn't respond with reassurance. Reassurance would have reset the pattern. Instead, I stayed neutral, polite, grounded. The imbalance became harder for him to ignore. He had built a life that functioned because I held the margins. Once those margins were gone, the structure felt tighter, less forgiving. Still, he didn't confess. He didn't admit anything. He didn't even ask directly if something was wrong. People avoid questions they don't want answers to. The consequences continued quietly. I finalized preparations, aligned timelines, confirmed protections. Everything moved into place without disruption. By the time he sensed something irreversible was happening, it had already happened. That's the thing about quiet consequences. They don't announce themselves. They accumulate. And when they become visible, it's too late to trace them back to a single moment. He felt loss without understanding its source. Loss of ease, loss of certainty, loss of the assumption that I would always adapt. And that loss unsettled him more than anger ever could. I didn't feel vindicated watching this unfold. I felt resolved, because consequences weren't something I inflicted. They were something I stopped preventing. And once prevention ends, reality takes over. The shift became visible to him slowly, and then all at once. At first, he tried small corrections, more questions, more presence. A casual suggestion of a weekend away, as if proximity could restore what had quietly moved out of reach. He wasn't panicking yet. He was adjusting tactics. I recognized it immediately. These weren't acts of accountability. They were attempts to stabilize comfort. I responded kindly, briefly, without reopening emotional access. That restraint confused him. People are accustomed to repairing things through conversation, through reassurance, through emotional negotiation. When those tools stop working, they don't know what to reach for next. He began asking if I was happy. It was the first direct question he'd asked in a long time. I answered honestly, but not expansively. "I'm clear," I said, and meant it. Clarity unsettles people who rely on ambiguity. His attention sharpened after that. He became watchful. The confidence he'd carried easily now had edges. He started filling silences again, this time with concern. But concern without accountability rings hollow. I didn't reveal what I knew. I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work on me. Revealing it prematurely would only have shifted focus onto his response. And I wasn't interested in managing that. He asked if we should talk to someone, if something had happened, if there was someone else. That last question was reflexive. I answered calmly, "No." He searched my face for something: anger, hurt, accusation. He found none. That absence frightened him. When people realize that emotional access has been revoked, they panic. Not because they've lost love, but because they've lost influence. He began apologizing for vague things, for being busy, distracted. Not himself lately. Apologies that didn't require admission. I didn't accept or reject them. I acknowledged them. Acknowledgement is not absolution. By the time he started to feel regret, real regret, it was already misaligned with timing. Regret works best before decisions are made. Afterward, it becomes commentary. I had already made my irreversible choice. He sensed it, though he didn't yet understand it. He felt the door closing without hearing it shut. And because he didn't know why, he believed it could still be reopened. It couldn't. I had crossed the threshold quietly, without spectacle. The part of me that negotiated had stepped aside. The part of me that required alignment had taken over. Nothing he offered during that period addressed the core issue, not the affair itself, but the assumption that I would remain available without consent. By the time panic entered his voice, it was already too late to fix anything. Panic doesn't rebuild trust. It exposes fear, and fear, once visible, cannot be mistaken for love. I didn't feel cruel holding my ground. I felt consistent. Consistency is what I have given for years. This time, I gave it to myself. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. There was no dramatic reveal, no raised voices, no demand for confession. By the time we sat down across from each other, the outcome had already been decided, by me. I chose the moment carefully, not for impact, but for clarity. A neutral evening, no audience, no urgency. I wanted the conversation to exist without adrenaline. I told him I knew. I didn't specify how. I didn't list details. I didn't name the other woman. I didn't need to. His reaction filled in everything. First confusion, real, not performed. Then the calculation. Then the subtle shift in posture when someone realizes the version of reality they've been relying on has expired. He asked what I meant. I repeated myself calmly, precisely. I know. Silence followed, the kind that reveals more than words ever could. He didn't deny it. He didn't deflect. He simply went still. That was confirmation enough. When he spoke, it wasn't with anger or defensiveness. It was with something closer to disbelief. Not that I knew, but that I was saying it this way, without accusation, without emotion. He expected pain, or rage, or bargaining. What he got was composure. He tried to explain, not fully, just enough to regain footing. Context, distance, timing, familiar refrains dressed as insight. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I said very little. I told him I wasn't interested in explanations that arrived only after discovery. That whatever story he wanted to tell himself didn't change the structure of what had happened. I didn't accuse him of ruining our marriage. I told him he had already exited it quietly, and I had simply chosen not to follow. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a conversation he could steer. He asked what I wanted. I want us to separate, I said. No qualifiers, no threat, just a fact. He asked if there was any chance to fix things. I answered honestly, no, not because I lacked forgiveness, but because repair requires mutual presence. He had made decisions under the assumption that mine was optional. I didn't shame him. I didn't moralize. I didn't remind him of everything I had given. I didn't need to. The absence of accusation left him with nowhere to argue. He asked when I had decided. I told him the truth before this conversation. That landed harder than any insult, because it meant he was no longer influencing the outcome, only witnessing it. We discussed logistics briefly, calmly, practicalities, next steps. The tone remained even, documentary. There was sadness in the room, but not chaos. When the conversation ended, there was no resolution to manage emotionally, no lingering debate. The structure had shifted, and we both knew it. I didn't feel powerful walking away from that conversation. I felt complete, because confrontation without heat isn't about dominance. It's about certainty, and certainty doesn't need volume. After the separation, people expected me to change in visible ways. They expected anger, or grief worn openly, or a dramatic reinvention. New hair, new habits, a public declaration of strength. Something that would help them understand what had happened. I didn't give them that. What changed wasn't how I looked, it was how I occupied space. For the first time in years, my energy wasn't distributed outward. I wasn't managing emotional climates, anticipating needs, or translating myself for comfort. My attention came back to me, not defensively, but deliberately. That shift was quieter than people expected growth to be. I learned that peace doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as absence. Absence of tension, of self-monitoring, of waiting for permission to matter. I didn't become hardened. I became precise. I speak when I have something to say. I pause when I don't. I no longer soften truths to preserve illusions. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect for reality. The most surprising part was how little bitterness I felt. Bitterness requires fixation. It keeps you anchored to the version of the story where you were wronged. I didn't want to live there. I wanted to live where clarity existed without resentment. I don't deny what happened. I just don't rehearse it. I understand now that my silence was never weakness. It was untrained power. Once I learned to direct it, it became discernment. Choice. I also stopped apologizing for my steadiness. Calm is not passivity. Restraint is not submission. Observation is not absence. These qualities were always strengths. I had just been using them to support other people's lives instead of my own. Now, when people underestimate me, I notice, but I don't correct them, not immediately. I've learned that being misread is often safer than being explained. I trust my internal alignment more than external validation. I don't rush decisions. I don't over-justify boundaries. I don't need dramatic closure to feel complete. The woman I am now is not louder. She is clearer. And clarity changes everything. I still believe in love. I still believe in partnership. But I no longer believe that endurance is proof of devotion. Presence is. Choice is. Mutual regard. If someone doesn't see me, I don't chase visibility. I step back and let the truth reveal itself. That's who I am now. Not someone who survived betrayal, but someone who learned to recognize herself in its aftermath. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer a lesson that sounds neat, something concise, a sentence that wraps everything up and reassures the listener that pain always leads to triumph in a visible way. Real life is quieter than that. What I learned didn't arrive as empowerment slogans or dramatic transformation. It arrived as a shift in how I understand responsibility, especially my responsibility to myself. For a long time, I believed being calm meant being accommodating, that being understanding meant absorbing imbalance, that love required patience even when patience was quietly erasing me. I don't believe that anymore. What I understand now is this. When someone benefits from your silence, they rarely ask if it costs you anything. And when you supply stability without boundaries, people begin to mistake it for permanence. That doesn't make them evil. It makes them unchallenged. The affair wasn't the beginning of the end of my marriage. It was the confirmation of something that had already been unfolding, the assumption that I would remain available, adaptable, and quiet, no matter what decisions were made without me. The truth didn't break me, it clarified me. And clarity doesn't demand revenge. It demands alignment. I didn't leave to punish him. I didn't leave to prove anything. I left because staying would have required me to continue playing a role that no longer matched who I was becoming. That's the part people often miss. Walking away isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about refusing to keep explaining your worth to someone who has already decided it's optional. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself, your time, your energy, your presence. It's the decision to stop performing stability for people who confuse it with compliance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't demand an apology that wouldn't change the structure that failed me. I simply stopped standing in a place that required my silence to function. And when I did, everything that depended on that silence revealed itself. If there's a moral here, it's not trust no one or leave at the first sign of discomfort. It's this: pay attention to who you become quieter around and ask yourself why. Because silence chosen consciously is strength. Silence demanded by a system that benefits from your erasure is something else entirely. You don't need to announce your limits for them to be real. You don't need permission to protect your future. And you don't owe anyone access to the parts of you they chose not to value. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, until you're ready to do everything that matters. And before we end, I want to ask you something, not as a lesson, but as an invitation. Have you ever looked back and realized that being underestimated wasn't your weakness, but the moment you quietly began to see the truth?